When I was in grade 8, I got to conduct an experiment that was every teenage boy's dream. There was a compulsory course in the curriculum they tried out in high school that year, and it was designed to help us become more vigilant consumers. We got to look at the new Consumer Protection Act that the provincial government had just released, and we also got to look at advertising. And in this class, we would sometimes take some advertising in TV or newspapers or magazines, and the teachers would walk us through and say, now, what's this advertising saying? What are they trying to sell? And what are the promises they're making that they can't keep up? And so it was great fun. And the teacher who taught the class at our high school was a big fan of a magazine called Consumer Reports. And this magazine would do some tests. They'd test vacuum cleaners or blenders or different kinds of paint. And they'd do tests in the lab, and they'd tell you which kind of paint worked best and which paint gave you the best value for your dollar and which washing machine was going to implode after 3 months of washing and so on. And as part of our coursework, we had to select a product, conduct a test, comparing different brands and prepare a report for the class. My older sister, who was 1 grade ahead of me in school, Rachel, when she took the class, she decided that it was okay to do things for a grocery item to test out some different food products. And she was on a health kick at the time, and she decided to test and evaluate about a dozen different kinds of low-fat vanilla yogurt. As a teenage boy, I was a great fan of desserts. I was not a great fan of health foods. And I have to tell you, there was no eating item that was less palatable to me than low-fat vanilla. I mean, it wasn't even cherry or blueberry straw. It was low-fat vanilla yogurt. And so she bought about a dozen different kinds of low-fat vanilla yogurt. And the family blinded. With blindfolds on, we had to taste test these different vanilla yogurts and tell her which ones we thought tasted best. Well, I didn't give a high score to any of the vanillas on her test. When it was my turn the following year, I thought I was going to do this right. And I got the family to taste 20 different brands of chocolate ice cream. That was something to test. And it was a dream come true. And when the test was over, we realized that we didn't have enough room in the freezer for the leftovers of 20 different brands of chocolate ice cream. And so for the next 18 hours or so, we quickly ate through as much chocolate ice cream as we could before it all melted, and we ended up conscripting some of the neighbors to help eat this ice cream before it melted. Life was good, but it was also my first bout of middle-of-the-night heartburn. I'd never had that before, and I discovered heartburn in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. after eating about 8 liters of chocolate ice cream on my own. In our text this evening, the preacher begins to conduct a test that, if we're honest, many of us would love to have the opportunity to try. But after all is said and done, it ends up leaving him with heartburn, both physically and emotionally. In chapter 1, the preacher, and we think that may well be Solomon, the preacher realizes that life is short, that it's repetitive, and that it's meaningless. And even as he tries hard to reflect about the meaning of life, he comes to the brutal realization that even the search for wisdom and for the meaning of life has a certain pointlessness to it. So in chapter 2, he considers some of the alternatives. He says, why think so hard? If there's no evident grand scheme in the arc of our lives, there's no apparent large overarching point to life, maybe the meaning is to be found in life itself and in the way it's lived and all of the pleasures and all of the things we can taste. And so the preacher, who appears to have access to more time and more resources and more power than the rest of us, proposes an experiment. He will treat himself to every pleasurable thing of life that you can imagine to see if he can find fulfillment in any of them. So if you turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, that chapter begins, I said in my heart, he's speaking to himself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. On the French-Canadian TV channels, I don't know if it plays in English as well, there's a lottery by Lotto Quebec that gives you $1,000 a day for life if you win this lottery. And they talk about all the things they're going to do with $1,000 a day. And they go through the list of going camping and kayaking and a fancy hotel and a fancy meal and and every time I see that ad, I think to myself, after day number 872, this must get pretty boring and you've run out of stuff to try. So there's a spoiler alert right from the beginning of chapter 2. He says, I'm going to try my hand at everything I can think of to have a little fun and to enjoy life. But right off the bat, he tells you you're going to get really tired of this. In verse 2, here's one of the first things he tried. I said of laughter, it is mad. Not mad in a bad sense. Mad, and it's actually a good sense in the Hebrew sense. I'll say, this is great. I'm going to laugh. I'm going to try this out. And of pleasure, what use is it? Now, I'm not sure if there were comedy clubs in Jerusalem when Solomon was there. Maybe Solomon had a court jester who knew all the good jokes. Or maybe he had a couple of clowns performing for him in the palace. We heard last week that he had musicians and servants and cooks and everything you can imagine. I'm sure there must have been a few guys in the palace who were good at telling jokes. Maybe he had a bunch of dad jokes from his father David. We don't know. Our French-Canadian culture, humor is one of the mainstays of our identity. It's not accidental that the Just for Laughs Festival is one of our better-known institutions. Earlier this week, when I was preparing to preach on this and to speak about laughter, I had no idea that I would get a call later in the week. And on Friday evening, I got a call to do the funeral for one of our leading French-Canadian comedians. It was a very depressing funeral. There were no prayers, there was nothing religious, there was no hope, there was nothing. They were just reflecting on how funny a guy he was and how good he was on screen and how good he was at remembering his lines. And it was sad to hear even some of his children reflect on, well, when he was home, he tried to be a good dad the best he could. A few of you know my own struggle with laughter that often becomes my defense mechanism. It's become increasingly dangerous to watch humor on television, or even to read it, because more and more of it is obviously becoming vulgar and abusive and insulting and demeaning. I find myself now, before I pick up a comedian's biography or before I pick up a book of jokes and humor, I always leaf through it very quickly to make sure it doesn't go too far off the rails. And of course, as we think about humor, between Robin Williams and Matthew Perry, Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy, and Fatty Arbuckle, and countless others, it's heartbreaking to see the number of great comedians who made millions of people laugh on stage and on screen, but whose laughter came from a very dark, deep, personal trauma, in several of those cases leading them even to take their own lives. It's intriguing that the experiment begins with something as seemingly innocuous as laughter that is not bad in and of itself. In fact, none of the things that the preacher is going to talk about tonight are bad per se. But ultimately, none of them brings fulfillment. Humor is great, but when the laughter stops, we're not getting closer to the meaning of life. So verse 3, laughter didn't work. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. Now we need to read verse 3 very carefully. He says that he tried to cheer his body with wine, but he isn't getting drunk. That's not the point. His consumption of wine is still guided by wisdom, which is an interesting expression. This isn't a guy with a quart of gin and a paper bag ambling drunk along the sidewalk in the middle of the night, getting up and throwing up in the alley. This is fine wine-tasting wisdom. This is a man with a taste for the finer things of life. No doubt he had a climate-controlled wine cellar with the finest collection of wines. In fact, in just a moment, we're going to read about the vines that he planted and groomed himself. No doubt he has servants who use the best of his grapes to produce the best quality wines. Several months ago, I celebrated the funeral of a man who had a really intriguing parcours de vie. He was a Frenchman and grew up in Provence and was a wine aficionado, and he was transferred by his company to Japan. He got to Japan in the 1950s and realized that nobody was making wines in Japan. And he studied the ground in Japan, he studied the soil and the sun and the climate, and during his holidays he would come back to France and find the right types of grapes and vines to plant in Japan. And this is the man who started the wine culture in Japan, and all of the Japanese winemakers now are descendants of the work that he did in the 1950s with a few vines that he snuck in his luggage as he left France and went to Japan on his holidays. Now, there are several moments where the book of Ecclesiastes will agree with the rest of Scripture that there is no pleasure in drunkenness and that overindulgence is a problem. He's not saying in verse 3 that he gets drunk every weekend. That's not the point. There's clearly no enjoyment in that. What he's saying is that he knows all the best wines, and he's tasting them with a fine palate, and maybe all of them coupled with the right kind of cheese and crackers and the right kind of side plate and the right kind of fish dish and meat prepared with it. And to feed all of those pleasures, to keep up that lifestyle, there's work to be done. This hedonist lifestyle was made possible by a spectacular estate. If this is indeed Solomon, the book of Kings tells us that it took him over 13 years to build this sumptuous residence with all the amenities. In verse 4, he begins to describe that. I made great works, refers to public works, things that he built. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. So he's the king. He's levying taxes from all of these territories, and he has to levy all of these taxes and all of these tributes to furnished a sumptuous lifestyle. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delights of the Son of Man. If Solomon were alive today, this is the kind of place that would be featured on those television shows about the lifestyles of the rich and famous. His estate would be featured on the cover pages of the great design magazines. The book of Kings makes the startling statement that between the construction projects on the temple, on his own palace, and the upkeep of his lifestyle, Solomon had a workforce of 30,000 servants. There were 30,000 people just keeping his estate running, between mowing the lawns, making the wine, planting the vineyards, cooking the meals every day. 30,000 people worked every day just to keep Solomon in all of the stuff that he liked to do. Some of them were construction workers in the building trades, but many of them were just around to make his lifestyle pleasant and comfortable. And along with the finest wines from his vineyard, there certainly would have been the best chefs and cooks from around the world. He didn't have a sound system, but he had something better: live musicians and singers. No doubt his meals would have been accompanied by the greatest of live entertainment, probably both music and comedians and actors putting on plays and dramas. And by the way, there's a little contention. In verse 8, our English translations use the word concubine, which makes us frown a little bit, but we're actually not sure that that's the meaning of the word there. It's not the usual word for concubine. We know what that word is, and this isn't that word in the Hebrew. There's a little debate about how it's translated. On the one hand, there's no doubt that Solomon overdid it with 700 wives and 300 concubines, but that's not the point of this portion of the text. This isn't about somebody going overboard, getting drunk, living low with prostitutes, and doing all of this stuff. That's not what this passage is about. This is about a wealthy, hardworking, industrious man with good taste and access to all the best life has to offer, fully enjoying the good life. Now, occasionally you've heard me complain about what you see at the checkout line when you're at the grocery store. You know, when you check out at the grocery store, and there's two things in the checkout line as you go. There's all that stuff you shouldn't be eating, like all the chocolate bars and all those treats and all that stuff that you really don't want your kids to eat, but they want your kids to see it while they're in the cart waiting to check out. That's pressure sales at the last. And the other thing they usually have by the counter there's all of these magazines. And there's some of those magazines, they're always in line in the checkout there, that when I'm standing in line, I have a tendency to flip around because I don't want to see the cover and I don't want other kids to see the cover when they're going through the checkout line. But these magazines, they serve a purpose. I love when the front covers of those magazines are plastered with the sad tales of all of the wealthy, good-looking Hollywood stars who have more money than you can count and who are still even unhappier than you are. And those magazines serve a point. Because even when you've been Botoxed and chemically and surgically enhanced to be the best you can be, and you have 3 personal trainers, and you make millions of dollars an episode, and you have a whole world helping you around you, and you live in $15 million penthouses in New York City by the Central Park, you're still as unhappy as all get all. And you might have as much money as Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, but you still can't keep your marriage together. And I like you to see those magazines as you check out, because they serve the same purpose as Ecclesiastes chapter 2. A man who had more money than you could count, who had more estate than you could count, who had 30,000 servants, still catering to his every whim, and you know what? He still wasn't happy. Verse 9. So I became great, and I surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I'd expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. I don't know if you ever tried to grasp a handful of wind. It's hard to hang on to a handful of wind, isn't it? So is that what it feels like this is trying to do? Because we don't read the text carefully enough, we often miss the point of this first part of his experiment in verse 2. This isn't somebody going all out, overboard in the party life, pulling out all the stops and living like Hugh Hefner and Jeffrey Epstein. This is not what's going on here. The point is that even the regular, normal pleasures of life, even in moderation, end up feeling empty. So having found no fulfillment in the pursuit of pleasure, the preacher turns to the second test in his little experiment. And actually here he steps back to where he briefly started. Back in chapter 1, he'd already started considering wisdom and knowledge. And he said, maybe a little philosophy, maybe pursuing knowledge, maybe that's a commendable, helpful goal. He had sidestepped that for a minute to try his hand at everyday pleasures, and when everyday pleasures feel empty, he goes back to try a little philosophy again. Maybe another degree at the university, or using a library card to check out the great classics. Maybe a little Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Émile Zola, maybe a little Aristotle, just to see what kind of wisdom was there. Verse 12, so I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there's more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. So far it's encouraging. It says, well, at least if you think through, if you try and figure stuff out, with a little intelligence, a little reflection, at least the wise person goes at it with some sense of direction. But alas, it turns out there's no great difference between the fool and the wise man. And being wise takes a lot more effort than being a fool. So ultimately says, if both suffer the same end, why trouble yourself trying to be wise? What's the point? It's a lot of hard work for nothing. You're still going to end up dying like the fool. Rest of verse 14, and yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. You know what event that is? You know what event happens to all men? Not taxes, the other one. Death. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there's no enduring remembrance, seeing that the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. This is one of the preacher's exaggerated statements. I hated life. It's not fair. I work hard, give myself all the trouble of trying to understand and trying to live wisely, and in the end, I end up no better than the fool who approaches life with no thought or effort. I spent a lot of time at the two large cemeteries, at Mount Royal and at Notre-Dame-des-Neiges. And as you go through the cemetery, there's interesting differences between the tombstones. You can see by the years and by the periods, there's different styles of tombstone that are in vogue. For a little while there, because it was easier on the maintenance of the cemetery, all the tombstones were flat on the ground. There were little plaques, little bronze plaques in the ground, and so it's easier for the lawnmower just to, they don't have to work around the monuments. And then there's a little while in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, they were trying to do out each other by how big their monuments were. And for a little while, the style was a big obelisk on top of your funeral stone, and you go through a section of the cemetery, and there's a 15-foot obelisk, and the guy next to it has a 16-foot obelisk, and the guy next has an 18-foot, and they try to go harder and harder. And then you go and you can see the Burks family and the Molson family and all of these wealthy families, and they don't have just a little tombstone. They have a little stone house built there where it's kind of a crypt where all the family is. And a little while ago, as I was going through with one of the young guys from the cemetery, and for a burial the next day, we were trying to find the burial plot we were going to go with the family. And as we're going through all of these stones, I get these moments where I try and drop these comments, just little hints to get conversations going. And we looked at all these stones. And man, he says, it's incredible, isn't it? The difference between all of these stones. And he says, some of them are big, huge, massive stone that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. And some of them are just tiny little stones. There's a section of the cemetery where St. Justine, it's called the Children's Garden. And all of the little stones there are all stillborn children. And often the families get to that point and it's really difficult financially. In a lot of these little children's stones, they just have like a tiny little tomb, just big enough for a name and a date. And as we were going through, he was pointing out to me, it's incredible the difference between the stones, these big, massive, large stones, and these tiny little ones, and these big, massive ones made out of white marble that must have cost a fortune. And I said, you know what? I said, very, very different stones. But I said, you know what? All these people, they all have one thing in common. They're all dead. The wise and the fool, they all end up the same way. But then he's got an added problem. It's not just the unfairness that I'm wise and I struggle hard to think through life and I'm going to die just like the fool next door who gives no second thought to life. But that's not the worst of the unfairness. He says, after I've died and I've worked hard to put all of this together, my children and their grandchildren, they're going to pilfer all this money away. Verse 18. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or whether he will be a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who's toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all his toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. Just before the Second World War, a lady called Ida Steinberg was a Jewish Hungarian immigrant, and she got out of Europe just in time before the beginning of the First World War. And she arrived with a little suitcase with about 3 or 4 pieces of clothing and the equivalent of about $10 Canadian. And she had a small apartment on Saint Laurent Boulevard, and just below her apartment there was a little spot, just big enough for a little store. And she started a little grocery store on Saint Laurent Boulevard. And it grew, and she was good to her neighbors, and they liked her. And she knew what her neighbors liked, and she was able to find the fruits and the vegetables and the meats that the Hungarians and the Italians and the Spanish and the Portuguese liked. And she brought these into her store, and this is stuff they couldn't get at the regular French-Canadian stores in Saint Laurent. So they kept coming to her store, and she took over the building next door, and the building after that, and the building after that. And soon, one of her 5 boys, Sam Steinberg, started working with her. And the two of them together, the business blossomed incredibly. For a while, it was the largest chain of grocery stores in Quebec, Ontario, and New Brunswick. And the business blossomed in added divisions. First, there was the Miracle Mart stores. Those of you who are old enough to remember that. Remember, they're like the nickel and dime stores. And then there were the picnic canteens, like little convenience stores all over the place. And then they started Price Club. Price Club was one of the original ancestors of Costco. Price Club was owned by Steinbergs. And they bought a 50% stake in Atlantic Sugar. And they had a real estate investment brand called Ivanhoe that owned shopping centers across Ontario, Quebec, and most of New Brunswick. And then one of the most heartbreaking turnarounds in business in Quebec history. Ida died. She left it to her son, who made it even better than she had made it. And within 10 years after Sam had died in 1978, the 3 daughters and his wife spent millions of dollars in lawsuits and court, arguing with each other about who would control the stores. While this was going on, nobody was paying attention to the stores, and soon it was partitioned and sold in pieces to avoid bankruptcy. And all that's left of the Steinberg legacy are a few historic signs and some memorabilia. There's one of the Metro stores in Saint Laurent. When you walk in and the tile mosaic, you can still see the old tile mosaic that says Steinberg's. It's one of the only pieces left. As the writer senses the end of life approaching, he fears that all of the hard work that he's done, all that he's put together, all the beautiful things that he's managed to build and to assemble after his death, they will be left to someone with far less skill and wisdom who doesn't really care about the value of what's been built. You work hard. You work so hard that you don't even have time to rest at night. And then you leave it to your children who pilfer it and dwindle it away without a second thought. We have a great economic concern in North America. As the boomer generation ages, there's panic setting among economists in North America. The generation that was born between 1945 and 1964 was the most enterprising, hardworking, and ingenious that we've ever seen. The amount of wealth they have produced during this generation was unprecedented and would likely never be matched again because they're very numerous, because they're enterprising and hardworking. And as they hit their 80s now and are beginning to die, over the next 20 years, they will be leaving several $1 trillion worth of inheritance to a generation that by and large does not know the value of work or the value of money. Many of them will see it as free money. And there's some fear that those trillions of dollars will be spent not only in ways that are unhelpful, but in ways that are harmful to themselves and to others around them and to the community at large. So, asked the preacher, what's the point of working hard? You work hard, you think things through, and in the end you die like the fool next door, and after you're dead, your children take everything you've built and dwindle it away without a second thought. Well, so far the preacher's experiment has been pretty depressing, and it's led to 3 disappointments. The pleasures of life that heightens our senses and feel good when they come, a good bottle of wine and a good meal shared with a good woman in a beautiful home, but ultimately that's all gone and it comes to an end. The pursuit of wisdom is good as far as it goes, and at least it keeps you out of immediate trouble, but ultimately the wise man dies just like the fool, so why work hard to get educated? And then the hard work lets you build up this great legacy that you enjoy, and it's great building it, but then after you pass away, within a couple of months, it's frittered away. So what are we to do? The preacher's response is what we call one of the carpe diem moments that are sprinkled throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. There's about 4 or 5 of these that we'll see throughout the book. Carpe diem is a Latin expression that means seize the day, seize the moment. There's nothing better, verse 24, there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he's given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The Hebrew phrase that's translated by enjoyment in verse 24 is a very interesting phrase. Literally it says that he makes his soul see good. Interesting, isn't it? This is enjoyment, to make your soul see good. It seems that it's not so much about the immediate pleasure of the senses. There's something that happens in the enjoyment of eating and drinking in our daily pursuits, and in the work that we find to do that does good not just to our body but to our souls, particularly when we see that all comes from the hand of God, and when we do them with an eye on Him. I'm not sure if you notice this, but it's even more pronounced in the Hebrew. In our English, in the 26 verses of Ecclesiastes 2, the pronoun I occurs 25 times in 26 verses. I planted this. I enjoyed wine. I did this. I did that. I built this. I did that. I built that. I enjoyed wine. I had this. I enjoyed this. I had these pleasures. And it's intentionally done. Because the emptiness of chapter 2 isn't just that the things that he enjoys are temporal, but that he enjoys them, therefore, I, me, and mine. The I is there 25 times in 26 verses, and the me and the mine and the possessives in the first person are there about another 24 times. Over 40 times in 25 verses, he said, me, mine, I, me, mine, I. He's been working hard, which is good, but it's for me. He's been thinking hard, which is good, but it's for me. He's been enjoying the good things that God has given, but it's for me. And none of this has been done with an eye on God, who has given us these good things to enjoy. How often, I wonder, do we make the same mistake the preacher made? Most of our lives are filled with good stuff. People who love us, safe homes, countless daily pleasures. Granted, we might not have as much to enjoy as Solomon had, but what we have is very much compared to what the rest of the world has. And we're particularly blessed compared to 90% of the rest of humanity who has lived on this planet. Even those of us who are poorest in Montreal are wealthier than 90% of the rest of the planet. Many of us now enjoy the things we asked God for in the past. That university program we got into, that good job we got, the nice home, the nice apartment that He helped us get, the spouse and the children that we have as an answer to our prayers from God. But we're enjoying His answers to our prayers as if He wasn't there. And often we're so busy with the answers to the prayers that He's given that we're too busy to remember Him. And so tonight, as we consider the first of several carpe diem moments in Ecclesiastes, in the first of several moments that gives us a hint about the final outcome, we get the beginning of a glimpse of the meaning of life. This is not the whole answer. There's more to come, but this is the beginning. There's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil as long as he remembers that all of this has come from God. Not just the things produced by our work, but even the work itself, even the ability and the strength to do it. Father, keep reminding us of the temporariness and the fleeting nature of things around us, of the stuff that we collect and the stuff that attracts our hearts and our eyes and that dazzle us. Father, remind us that these good things are created by You for our enjoyment, for our nourishment, but they are gifts from You. And even the ability to earn them and to enjoy them, all of them are gifts from You. Father, You ask us to enjoy these things, but to remember that they are all a grace and a gift from You, freely given, to be enjoyed with grateful hearts, with the focus on You and not on ourselves. Give us this grace, we ask. In Christ's name, amen.